What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily. So an interesting stat that folks, for some reason, still refuse to believe is that Samsung's top-tier S-series phones are never really their best sellers over the course of a year. While it is true that for a few weeks after their launch, the newest S flagships do sell well, and sometimes sneak their way into the list of top 10 bestsellers for that quarter, but the rest of the year, and often well into the following year, the best-selling Samsung smartphone has been some iteration of this. This is the A15, and for the second quarter this year, its 4G and 5G versions far outsold any of Samsung's 2024 S-series phones. In fact, during the first quarter of 2024, the A15 nearly outsold the S-series, and that was when the S-series was announced as the hot new release. For 2023, the A14 4G and A14 5G were the only other Samsung smartphones to make the bestsellers list overall, along with the A04e. The S-series was nowhere to be found. And in 2022, the A13 was so popular, it was even outselling iPhones. The A03 also made that list, but again, no S-series cracked the top 10. And I even found the chart for 2021 just for good measure. You'll see the A12 there sitting stout in 6th place. There was even a couple Xiaomi phones that year that sold well, but no S-series on that list either. Now, my intention in providing this information, if you choose to believe it, isn't to use it to disparage Samsung's flagship phones. I already did that in a different video. Instead, I wanted to first prove that yes, this phone has in fact been the choice for literally millions of people for the last 4+ years, even if you're in denial about that. And I also really want to just try and explain why it's such a big seller. I guess part of the explanation is probably because Samsung's S-series has been a bit stale, and it's been tough for them to entice people to fork over $700 or $800 or $1,000 on a phone that really hasn't changed much. I think another explanation you'll often see is that these inexpensive Samsung smartphones are mainly sold in other, more populated regions where people tend to buy cheaper phones. But if you want to look at, say, US-only smartphone sales data, you'll see a similar trend here too. The A15 is the best-selling Samsung and Android device in general right now. The A14 outsold the S-series, the A12 was uber popular, so even in a region where it sometimes feels like everyone has a $1,000 smartphone in their pocket, that's not really the case. No, the main reason this phone sells so well year after year, I think, is because when you compare apples to apples, or Samsungs to Samsungs, this sub-$200 phone isn't like 1/4 of the device that an S-series is at, say, $800. It's not even half the device. For the average everyday person who just uses their phone to call, text, browse social media, snap some pictures, and watch a YouTube video, this A15 is like 90% as good as the S-series for a quarter of the price. And this year's A15 in particular brought about a couple of upgrades, actually quite a few upgrades, like an AMOLED screen and a Mediatek processor, and double the storage and an ultrawide camera lens and faster charging that pretty much make it not just the best budget phone, but maybe the best all-around bang for your buck Samsung phone that you can buy, regardless of its lower price point. Before we get into all that, I want to just clarify that while there are once again two different A15s out there, an A15 4G LTE and an A15 5G, both these phones are way more similar than in years past. Samsung used to differentiate the 4G and 5G phones with more than just their network support. Like they'd sometimes have different screens for some reason, or different internal specs that made one way better. And they'd release the two different phones in two different parts of the world. But this year, aside from the processors being a little different due to the corresponding 4G and 5G network band support, everything else with these two phones is identical. So I'm just going to refer to the phone as the A15 moving forward. And regardless of which A15 you have, just know it's the same specs, same build, basically the same phone for this year. Now, one thing I think people still value with the A15 and all of Samsung's A-series phones really is its big size. At 6.5 inches, it's big, and I realize like Every Android phone nowadays seems to be between 6.5 and 6.7 inches, but not the S series. The regular S24 is kind of small, and the comparable S phone size-wise to this one is actually the S24 Plus. Obviously, from the front, I think a lot of you can immediately tell the difference between a flagship phone and a budget phone. The black bezels that frame the display are really obvious on the A15, and you have a pretty dated selfie camera notch and thicker bottom chin that yields you a much lower screen-to-body ratio. It's a much older, more budgety looking device, but to be honest, I still see a ton of comments from people saying they don't care about the bezels, or what's a bezel? So to each their own. I guess if the size of the screen is all you really care about, the A15 is just as big as a phone that's like 4 times its price. Around back, I personally love the A15's sort of holographic light blue colorway. There are some other color options for this phone, but this one is definitely the best. Subtle, but interesting, unique without being too obnoxious, and design-wise, with this and the S24 Plus face down, I mean, you really can't tell them apart. So for those of you who wouldn't be caught dead with a cheap phone in your hand, I don't think a lot of people would even be able to tell. However, the A15 is made of plastic, and more plastic. On the back with its matte, soft touch plastic rear cover, on the sides and the frame, it feels thick, like it could be metal, but it isn't. And the front glass, well, it's glass obviously, but a cheap no-name glass. It's also very glare-prone and fingerprinty. It's not the cheapest, junkiest feeling phone in the world. And again, maybe some people can't even tell the difference. Maybe some people like plastic, since it could be a little tougher, but the A15's build definitely aligns with its budget classification here. For the rest of its physical bits, there's 2 good things and 1 bad thing. The headphone jack at the bottom, that's good. People still want this, even for as much as Samsung pushes their various wireless earbuds. The physical SIM card tray on the side still supports 2 SIMs or a micro SD card. I mentioned earlier that the A15 ships with twice the amount of storage this year, 128 gigabytes for its base configuration, or there is a 256 gigabyte model out there if you can find it. But popping in a micro SD card to move over photos or files to save space is always a nice option to have, especially since Samsung seems keen on cramming every single app imaginable onto their phones out of the box nowadays. I see a lot of people complaining about this now, and it is pretty ridiculous. Some stuff like Samsung members and global goals can be removed, but the fact that their Max VPN app, for example, is stuck on your phone, it's kind of annoying. The negative physical bit for the A15 is actually its lack of dual speakers, which is kind of an odd omission on a phone that has literally everything else. And I think the out loud listening experience suffers a little bit because of that. Since it's a budget phone, you still get the side-mounted physical fingerprint sensor that doubles as your power button, and this isn't a negative really. I like this setup. I think it's convenient and consistent. And with Face Unlock, you have 2 quick options to get into the phone. But one thing that's odd is that the buttons on this phone, particularly the power button, feel extra cheap and hollow. I don't know if I maybe got a bad A15 or a bad set of buttons, but no other A-series phone has buttons this cheap and comically clicky. So overall, the top 2 reasons, in my opinion, to consider the A15 this year besides the price is 1, the display, and 2, the Mediatek processor that powers the phone. If you can look beyond the big black borders, Samsung gave this A15 the exact screen it deserves. It's now a Super AMOLED display at the Full HD resolution with a 90Hz refresh rate. That's pretty much as good as you're going to get for under $200, and the addition of AMOLED is really the most important element. Previous cheap A-series phones had dim, dull LCD displays, but the A15 is finally the bold, bright, colorful sort of screen that even the average person, I think, can recognize as looking good. At up to 800 nits of peak brightness, yeah, you're still going to battle some glare. And the screen glass, like I already mentioned, isn't anything recognizable, so fingerprints galore. But the viewing experience is still brighter, bolder, more vibrant, and more visually enticing than it's ever been on a phone like this. And it was really the final piece that this phone needed to truly have no real compromises with the screen. At the full HD 2340 by 1080 resolution, it's also perfectly sharp. That's the same resolution as almost any other $500 or higher smartphone. And with the 90Hz refresh rate enabled, the phone feels fast enough and visually seems fluid enough to kind of beat out its budget distinction. I think you'll still find regular folks who have a hard time discerning refresh rates, but if the phone seems more snappy to the average person, that's all that matters. And that's what you get here with 90Hz. This is a viewing experience I really can't complain about, and I think it should probably be the bare minimum for any smartphone nowadays, even one of the cheapest on the market. Now, that collective sigh of relief you hear is from a certain percent of people who are probably so pleased to see that this phone is powered by a Mediatek Dimensity 6100 Plus processor, or if you have the non-5G A15, the Mediatek Helio G99. This phone could be powered by a Mediatek Banana, and people would still probably prefer it over anything Exynos. And if there were folks who skipped last year's A14 because of the Exynos 1330, I think this SoC choice is going to bring them back. You also can technically find A15s with either 4, 6, and even up to 8 gigabytes of RAM, but I think most people will only have the 4 gig option. That's fine. I mean, obviously this phone isn't going to be competing with an S24 Ultra or anything too far outside its price point, but really, if you wanted to push this phone a little harder, you totally could. Here are the Geekbench scores, if you care to see some numbers to compare. I've found that even gaming on this phone at a higher frame rate and graphics settings is totally fine. And MediaTek's Dimensity and Helio chipsets are tried and true and fan favorites amongst budget enthusiasts. In fact, the Dimensity 6100 Plus is still kind of new. It only just crossed the 1-year-old mark. If you're familiar with budget devices, you might expect a phone like this to have something a lot older, 2 or 3 years old, to save money and keep the phone cheap, but not this time. And I also think that if you still have a low-tier Samsung phone from 2 or 3 years ago, you might also expect a dumbed-down version of Android or One UI. Samsung used to call it One UI Core, but they don't really offer that anymore on the A series. This is the full-on Android 14 and One UI 6.1 experience you'd see on an S series, for the most part, minus the new Galaxy AI features, of course, and Samsung DeX. None of that stuff will ever come to a phone like this, but if that's not important to you, you're not missing much else. In fact, you won't miss out on much for a few years to come. Samsung is promising 4 years of Android updates and 5 total years of security updates for this phone, which I think is just about the perfect amount of time to get your money's worth with this phone, wait for an actual new upgraded phone to come out later on down the line, and swap into that without suffering through an older OS or unsupported updates. I think more than anything though, like I alluded to at the start of this video, this is just the sort of phone that probably is intended for people who do just the basics and not a whole lot more. They cycle through a dozen or so apps throughout the day, social media, texting, YouTube videos, maybe a couple of games here or there, but otherwise not much more. They just want a simple, reliable, familiar phone within Samsung's ecosystem with the Android experience, with the software updates that just work and that isn't $1,000. And that's precisely what this phone is. It's easy for really tech-savvy folks to criticize a cheap phone like this as underpowered, clunky, ugly, dated, or even e-waste. But for a vast majority of people, this is all the smartphone they need. This is all the smartphone they use. Anything beyond this is just unnecessary. It is a waste. They're paying for software or hardware they're not using. With the A15, I think you end up paying for exactly what you need, what you use, and that's what people are looking for. So one thing that's probably going to go underutilized and underappreciated on the A15 this year is the faster charging. You wouldn't know it, but this phone supports 25-watt wired charging speeds being pumped into its big old 5,000 milliamp battery. The battery size, by the way, is great, but it's just as big as any other A series or Motorola phone or anything else you can think of. The 25-watt charging speed, though, that's an upgrade over last year. You probably wouldn't know that, though, because Samsung Samsung doesn't really tell you, and they don't give you a wall plug to use those faster charging speeds. And if there was ever a time to give people a faster charger in the box, this would be it. I still, to this day, see people at airports using an older USB-A wall adapter for like their current flagship phone. I mean, talk about an unintended consequence of pushing sustainability. Rather than giving everyone newer, faster, more efficient accessories that these affordable phones now support, it's up to the consumer to figure it out, or else use old, outdated, slow charging. And most everyday people have no clue about charging speeds or plug types. So they're probably using what was given to them 3 or 4 years ago, which is a huge bummer. Fortunately, you won't have to plug the phone in often. It's going to be a full day device for most people, unless you're totally addicted to staring at your phone all day, which, okay, most of us are, but the big battery, budget specs, and less power-hungry users are going to appreciate that longevity. Finally, while Samsung certainly didn't bring the camera setup up to the level of a flagship phone, they finally ditched the gimmicky add-on lenses that were just there for show, and gave the A15 a triple lens package that makes sense. The 50 megapixel main seems to be the same as last year, but the secondary lens is now a 5 megapixel ultrawide, the go-to secondary lens for most people for sure. Samsung did, however, keep the 2 megapixel macro. It was the depth sensor that they ditched. And I suppose the one time you need to take a very close-up picture, the macro may come in handy. The selfie camera, I think, is the same as like the last few years. It's a 13 megapixel lens. And while this phone is still far removed from what most smartphone companies are pushing nowadays, I think the A15's camera is a couple steps above the subpar pictures and videos these budget phones used to offer you. There's no 4K video recording, but there's enhanced video stabilization. There's a 50 megapixel picture mode, but your other extras are reduced to a Snapchat fun filter, a food mode, and most of the other basics that you'll use probably once in your lifetime. Honestly though, while it's easy to criticize a budget phone like this when even a $400 phone would have so much more to offer, the A15 can take a nice looking picture. Real life is nowhere near this colorful or saturated, so maybe disable the auto HDR or be mindful of the over processing this phone does to compensate on hardware. And when the sun goes down, this phone is still going to struggle regardless of its dedicated night mode. But honestly, we've come a long way from the budget picture takers of yesteryear. This isn't a terrible setup, all things considered, especially with the wide-angle lens now, and for the purposes of snapping average everyday pictures, it'll do you just fine. So why the heck does everyone on Earth buy one of the cheapest Samsung phones on the market year after year? Well, because it's a darn good phone, especially for the price. And when you compare this to something that's 4 or 5 times as much, it's just not that much worse of a phone by comparison, especially when you consider how little most people use the extra features on a flagship that you're supposedly paying more for. On top of that, Samsung actually upgraded this phone this year with more new things than seems to hit most other expensive phones nowadays. So I'm truly not surprised that this A15 is a bestseller once again. This is the phone I would recommend to most anyone who just needs a familiar, functional Android or Samsung device with a little extra on top. The nice AMOLED screen, the decent specs, the wide-angle camera, the fast charging, and bigger battery. Most people are just thumbing through TikTok on their phone anyway, so what more could you need? For a vast majority of the population, this is all the smartphone they do need, and I'm not surprised it's been the choice for so many people year after year. But what do you guys think? Am I oversimplifying things? Maybe being a little insulting? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course, especially if you have the A15 right now yourself. Definitely let me know your experience with it so far. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video, or at least found it somewhat interesting. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.